Is the current crisis in Ukraine Cold War Redux? Dr. Tom Morgan, Director Emeritus of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice at the College of St. Scholastica, will share his reflections and insights on this crisis in Ukraine. As an Associate Professor Emeritus of Russian, he has a unique perspective on this topic, having traveled to Russia on numerous occasions. I and many others in our congregation have had the pleasure of working with Tom for many years in the Duluth Sister Cities organization. Thank you, Tom, for your flexibility in doing this on such short notice.
Okay, thank you, Sherry, for those kind words. And thank you all for coming and for your interest. I'm humble because I'm here on Tioga Street. You know, I'm not in Washington, D.C. or in Moscow or Kiev. And if you want really in-depth analysis, there's lots of places to go where people are closer to the situation than I am. And I think you all know that. So I'm not trying to put myself in the position of the New York Times or CNN or anything like that. But I do have some observations. I guess we all do. And I have to say that this whole geopolitical struggle, this game that we're essentially talking about, is not where my chief interest lies. And it's like a giant, I've never liked political science to the extent that it turns into a giant chessboard and we're changing the colors on the maps and this army moves there and this leader goes there, and it's all like a big Monopoly game. And we lose the fact that I think we lose the fact that we're dealing with people's lives and people who just, as to paraphrase Anton Chekhov, they just want to go home and eat their dinner. And this is lost. And I don't know that it leads to long-term peacemaking. It leads to truces and stalemates, but a kind of negative peace, but not a positive peace. And so I have to say from the beginning, if you're looking for solutions to this issue, I don't have a long-term solution. I hope this is working now. Is my screen share working?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay.
There's a couple of little blinks across the top of it, but we can see most of it. So you should be great, Tom.
All right. Okay. What really charges my batteries is citizen diplomacy. And I think you all know that I've been involved in that for 35 years. Peacemaking at the local level, from my money, is the only long-term solution to any of these kinds of problems. If we're talking about geopolitics, we tend to dehumanize and we tend to abstract things. And so, as you know, I've been involved in that for a long time. Right now, we're having trouble, you know, at the Duluth Sister Cities office because of the geopolitical realities and because of global health too, the COVID thing. But I want you to know, I just want to say this because I don't want this to get lost, that right now we haven't given up. I have partners, we have partners in Petrozavodsk, people that I've known for 30, 35 years. We're close friends. They don't like Putin, of course. And we are engaged right now we're working on a high school exchange involving high school students in Petrozavodsk, working with high school students at the Fond du Lac Indian Reservation to do a series of short videos and programs about water and the issues of water in northwestern Russia and in northeastern Minnesota. So we continue to work on this. I see this as peacemaking in the long term. A more sophisticated way of talking about that is kind of two-track diplomacy. And that simply means people at higher levels in each other's societies talk to one another, and in that way they can in some way influence the real decision makers who are in government. So I just wanted to get that on the table. Now we're going to talk about geopolitics, because I think we have to, even though I don't like to. A little history lesson. Putin said Ukraine is not a country. He said that in 2008, and he's gone on and at some length about his own history, his own view of the history of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. You know, to some extent, I think Putin is right. That is to say, and that's the tragedy of this. We had a Ukrainian student living with us not too many years ago. Julie and I did, and he lived with us for 4 years while he was at St. Scholastica. He has a Ukrainian last name because his father is Ukrainian, his mother is Russian, and many of his relatives, including his grandmother on his mother's side, lives in Russia. I have a close colleague in Petrozavodsk, and she is Russian, but much of her family lives in Kiev, and so on. It is a kind of one society, even though, of course, there are differences. And in some ways, that makes it even more tragic, I think, this war that is being waged right now. Solzhenitsyn, back in 1990, sort of recognized the commonality of the cultures that maybe should come together and form a country and forget about the Soviet Union and all this empire building. I think that's true in the sense that Norway, Sweden, Denmark are kind of one culture with minor variations. That's what I mean by this. Now, a little background on Ukraine. The word Ukraine is it comes from an old Russian word, which really means kind of the outlying areas or the borderlands. And the modern Russian word that is connected with that is krai, which means edge. So in a sense, Ukraine has always meant the borderlands, the edge of the world, as it were. Its very name is from a Russian perspective. For years, in my dialect of English, I would say the Ukraine. And we live in the Ukraine, or this is happening in the Ukraine, or Stalin did this in the Ukraine. After Ukraine got its independence in the early 90s, they actually passed a resolution in their Rada, their legislature, to take that "the" off. They found that dehumanizing. We say Minnesota, we don't say the Minnesota. We'll say the Midwest because the Midwest is part of something bigger. So that's part of it. In the Russian language, the language that I learned when I was learning Russian back in the 1970s, you would say in Russia, in France, in Finland, but you would say on Ukraine, like on an island. And that has changed in the Russian language. We now say in Ukraine. It's kind of a politically, but it shows it's not necessarily, historically has not been an equal relationship between Russia and Ukraine. In maps up into, I have a map that dates back into the early 20th century, where you talk about Great Russia and Little Russia, and that's Ukraine. In some of his remarks, Putin has actually used those terms, Great Russia and Little Russia. So another mentality, I think that I've talked about this before in other talks, I don't want to make too much out of this, except you know what it means to have, you know the term, I think, most of you, about American exceptionalism, that we know best for the whole world. Well, there's a kind of Russian exceptionalism too. And I think Putin, there's a strong streak of that in the Russian mentality. Putin has really adopted that in the last few years. In his early part of his regime, he was very much interested in being a part of Europe and being part of the Western Alliance and so on. But of later years, he says things like this, you know, that we're basically evil and perverse and perverted, and we're Satan worshipers. I mean, this is why I'm beginning to wonder about his mental stability. But that goes down well. You remember some of that came out in the Sochi Olympic Games, where he was speaking against gay and lesbian people. So that is part, he's playing on that theme now, and to some extent, until this invasion, which of course changes everything, but until this invasion, he got a lot of sympathy for that. What's more, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I've talked about this at great length, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, except to say that Russians feel in general humiliated and disrespected ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union for a lot of reasons. Here's just one case in point, something that Barack Obama said in 2016. You can read it for yourself, right? No, they're weak. Well, actually, their economy, I believe, is about the size of the economy of Italy. And Obama there is rubbing his nose in it a little bit. Another characteristic, I think, is true of Russians everywhere, even today. They're terribly afraid of an invasion. They've been invaded so many times. It's an easy country to invade. Napoleon, Hitler, and others too. So Putin is certainly playing on that and the idea of fear. And of late, to explain Putin, when Putin took office in 1999 and up into the first 8 or 10 years, the economy was booming and he was very popular. Now the economy is not doing so well. Inflation and shortages and really not a lot of economic growth. Well, that's, if you're an autocrat, one way to deal with that is you start a war, isn't it? To get people's attention away from it. But let's go back in history a little bit. Remember this? Some of you might remember it. Partners for Peace. And this was started just a couple of years after the collapse of the Soviet Union under the Bill Clinton regime, and where NATO and Russia actually worked together and were trying to rethink the whole idea of security in Europe. Not just, remember, the creation of NATO was supposedly to keep the Russians out, the Germans down and the Americans in, right? But now with no Soviet Union anymore, then maybe we can rethink all of European security. And that's what the Partners for Peace was about. And there were numerous military exercises in the 1990s, especially the early 1990s, involving NATO forces and Russian forces. There were 2 that I know of in the United States and 2 in Russia, and I think 1 in Ukraine. So we actually were working there together, and I have to at least try to show you, if I can, at least one picture that you might find interesting. Here it is. This is a picture shot in 1996. And this is a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia during that awful war in Yugoslavia. And that is a Russian soldier and an American soldier working together under the command of an American general. Imagine that. One more shot I have for you, if I can. I'm now always have trouble figuring things out, but I can probably do it. Hang on, it's coming. Here it is. I just have to show you this. It's not a very good picture. I got it out of a book, but I have to show you. There is, this is about the same era, about 96. There is Secretary of Defense William Perry, American Secretary of Defense William Perry, and the Soviet minister, or he was Secretary of Defense, Soviet Minister of Defense, Pavel Grachev, and they're holding signs. They're saying the desired result, NATO plus Russia equals success. So at one time, we were working together. At one time, we were working together, and the question is, what happened? I don't want to say it's all our fault. How did we get to be such enemies all of a sudden? But I think we played a role. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the rejection of communism by all these Eastern European countries, there was a huge readjustment in Europe, wasn't there? And the Warsaw Pact collapsed. It made, of course, the Russians nervous. And they made a deal, an unwritten deal, and it began with James Baker, who was Secretary of State under George Bush Sr., that Germany could be reunited as one big country, and Germany could be a member of NATO. And for that concession, Baker said, not 1 inch eastward, NATO will go. And this promise was repeated again and again, not only by American officials, but by British officials, German officials, and others. And yet, what happened? Well, it mostly happened, it began in 1997 when we allowed the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland into NATO. And there were several other incidents, most of them under Putin's regime, where NATO got closer and closer and closer to the Russian border. And Russians took that as a threat. Remember their mentality about being surrounded and being threatened with invasion. Putin kind of laid down a marker in 2007 in a speech in Munich. Well, there it is. Stop doing this. Treat us at least with a modicum of respect. We do not threaten you or your allies. Why do you refuse us the security you insist for yourself? By this time, Russia had been more or less booted out of NATO. And what was the reason? There were several people at the time that this was happening, beginning in 1997, who testified before Congress. They weren't quiet about it, against this, that this expanding NATO eastward will be the beginning of another Cold War. And I give you a quote from Jack Matlock, who was here in Duluth a few years ago, by the way, quite a few years ago, maybe 15 years ago. You know, and there are his credentials, and you can read what he had to say. Another very strong voice against it, who also testified, was Charles Keenan, the famous Cold Warrior, who actually gave us the strategy of containment against the Soviet Union. He also thought that this was a huge mistake and will lead to a Cold War. And also William Perry, who was in the Clinton administration, there he is again, also said the same thing, that this was a huge mistake. So let me just find a map here. I've got a map here somewhere. Here it is. That will show you, I think, what we're talking about and how the world looks to Putin and to the Russians. You see that? All these countries, the Baltic countries and Poland, well, the whole thing, all the way to Turkey. And even, gosh, Northern Macedonia and Albania are in NATO. Everybody is in NATO. And who's the enemy? Not only that, we now have, as you perhaps all know, big American military bases in Romania, and we're building another big one in Poland with all kinds of nuclear weapons pointed at you know who. So this is kind of Russia's point of view, and this is the message that Putin has been sending again and again. Let me give you a press conference that Putin gave first of the year, early part of the year, and this press conference, is taken from the New York Times. So it's you're going to get a little advertisement here, but I think it's still worth showing to you. So let's see if it works.
Мы ясно и четко дали понять, что дальнейшее движение НАТО на восток неприемлемо. Ну чего здесь непонятного? Мы что ли ставим ракеты рядом с границами Соединенных Штатов? Нет. Это же Соединенные Штаты своими ракетами пришли к нашему дому. На пороге нашего дома находятся уже. Ну, разве это какое-то избыточное требование? Не ставить больше никаких ударных систем у нашего дома. А вы требуете от меня каких-то гарантий. Вы должны нам дать гарантии. Вы. И немедленно. Сейчас. А не забалтывать это десятилетиями. Не мы кому-то угрожаем. Мы что ли пришли туда, к границам США? Или к границам Великобритании? Или куда? К нам пришли. И теперь еще говорят, нет, теперь и Украина будет в НАТО.
So that's Putin's problem, you know, with he feels threatened, and he also feels like, I think, his hold over the Russian sphere of influence is weakening because Ukraine, of course, beginning in 2014 or even before then, was trending towards the West. Remember the big uprising in 2014? It was all about Ukraine trying to get into the European Union, and Putin tried to put a stop to that, of course. On the other hand, I think you can make a pretty good argument. I don't have time to make it, but you can make a pretty good argument that America's hands were all over that, or a part of that revolution in 2014, overthrowing that elected president of Ukraine. So from the beginning, Putin has been suspicious and been uncomfortable with that, with moving into his sphere of influence. Other things that we have done that not only bothered Putin, but bothered Russians in general, and that is, well, the bombing of Serbia during the war in Yugoslavia, when NATO took it upon himself to bomb Serbia, one of Russia's close allies. And we never consulted with Russia. They were not part of the planning. This was past, you know, that the time when Russia was cooperating with NATO. And then the final insult from the Russian point of view, I want to give you the Russian point of view, is when George Bush Jr., I think this was about 2002, if I'm not mistaken, pulled us out of the ABM treaty. And so that also was seen as a warlike act by Putin. Well, now here we are. I had to tell you that I didn't predict, or I didn't believe this would happen, that Putin would invade Ukraine. I just thought, this is why I'm nervous about it, I thought he was too smart to do that. And I thought the bloody battle that will ensue and the ugliness that will ensue would be just too much, and maybe more than he could handle. And that remains to be seen. But recent developments make me even more nervous. Now he's putting his nuclear weapons on, generals on alert with nuclear weapons, and that, of course, scares me. What are we doing? Well, we're putting up sanctions, and the sanctions, I suppose, may work. I don't know. We don't have a really great history of sanctions in the use of weaponry, but that's what we're doing, and it will take a long time for them to work, I think. Meanwhile, what does Putin really want? Well, before I answer that question, we just got time. Let me play you one little anti-sanction song that is running around the airways in Russia, and has been for some time now, the last, I don't know, a couple of months anyway. And well, I think it speaks for itself. And then I want to make a couple of concluding remarks.
Что мы об этом думаем? Как же нас достали эти НАТО и ЕС. Пусть тебе засунут свой технический прогресс. Помидоры, огурцы и бабушкин компот. Как тебе Америка, Россия, разворот? Не хотим из пластика говядину и кур и катастрофических хот-договых фигур. Загнивает Запад, сыр из плесени жует. Никакие санкции не сломят наш народ. Скажем дружно, ничего от вас не нужно, ни для русских из Макдональдса еда. Вы нам санкции придумали натужно, мы эмбарго наложили вам сполна. Приползла Европа на коленях в Вашингтон. Просят разрешения на нас катить баллон. Мы терпели очень долго и хотим сказать: господа, не забывайте, где живет Пускина мать. Никогда Россию иностранцам не понять. Вам хотим спасибо мы за санкции сказать. Поднимем производство, как велел наш президент. На ограничения у нас иммунитет. Скажем дружно, ничего от вас не нужно, ни для русских из Макдональдса еда. Вы нам санкции придумали натужно, мы эмбарго наложили вам сполна. Наложили вам сполна. Скажем дружно, ничего от вас не нужно, ни для русских из Макдональдса еда. Вы нам санкции придумали натужно, мы эмбарго наложили вам сполна. Наложили вам сполна.
Sorry about that. There. Okay, we're back. So I don't know what you think of all that, but for me, I mean, the sanctions may work, but this is the wrong path, the long-term wrong path. I end with where I started. The right path is people-to-people diplomacy, getting to know one another, and doing what we're trying to do with these Ojibwe people and the Russian high school students is come up with joint solutions to common problems we have on the globe. I gotta say, when we started this thing, we're still in the middle of it. The kids were introducing one another and showing videos of each other's lives, you know, life in northern Minnesota, life in northwestern Russia. But a couple of the kids said, the American kids said, wow, they're just like us. What an insight. And that's peacemaking. Well, what does Putin want? Well, he wants to reestablish Russia as a world power, in my opinion, make them matter and play the game as a major player. He wants Russia's influence felt in Europe and respected. And of course, he wants Ukraine to stay in the Russian sphere of influence along with other countries. Well, that's a half an hour's worth of wisdom.